Should children receive the COVID-19 vaccine? This question is being debated literally as we speak. It's all over our newspapers, the front page of the Jerusalem Post today. It's being debated by parents, grandparents, physicians, medical organizations, policymakers, and governments. The Pfizer vaccine for children 12 to 15 has already been approved. The vaccine in trials showed 100% efficacy in preventing infection. And recently, Pfizer submitted data to the FDA showing that in 5 to 11-year-old children, the vaccine was 90% effective in preventing symptomatic disease. And children who received the vaccine in that age group achieve the same level of immunity as older populations. And so yesterday, the FDA Advisory Committee met and voted 17-0 with one abstention in favor of the vaccine, stating that the benefits of the vaccine in 5 to 11-year-olds outweighed the risks. And it's anticipated that later in the week, the FDA will accept the recommendations of this committee and authorize the vaccine for that age group. And next week, the CDC will evaluate the data and likely make recommendations for how the vaccine should be administered. Prime Minister Bennett, the Israel Ministry of Health, will be reviewing the data, and likely the vaccine will be offered in Israel shortly to children 5 to 11 years old. Now, there's also ongoing data and studies taking place right now looking at the vaccine in kids 6 months to 4 years of age, and likely that data will be mature in the next few months, and the vaccine will be offered to them as well. And so those who argue in favor of the vaccine argue that the vaccine will prevent infection in children, it will prevent severe disease, it will prevent complications of COVID, it will prevent long COVID, it'll prevent transmission to others, and it will contribute to herd immunity. Those who argue against the vaccine point out that the vaccine in children, that COVID in children is very mild, that we really don't know the long-term side effects of the vaccine, and that the vaccine does increase the risk of myocarditis, inflammation of the lining of the heart, and that perhaps we should hold off on vaccinating kids and redistribute the doses to poor countries that haven't even vaccinated 1% of their high-risk adult population. So the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, several countries across the world have opened up the vaccine to anyone above the age of 12 across the board. Brazil has reserved it only for children above the age of 12 who are high risk, and the World Health Organization actually recommends that wealthy countries hold off on vaccinating children and send the vaccines to countries like in Africa, where very few have been vaccinated and the adult population and healthcare workers are at risk. So how would Halacha resolve this debate? Would Halacha obligate parents to vaccinate their children against COVID-19? Does Halacha obligate children to undergo vaccination against COVID-19? Do children have an obligation in the mitzvah, lo talmod al dam reyecha, do not stand idly by? So before we answer that question, I'd like to present a little bit more scientific background. In the first 3 waves of COVID-19, children made up about 1 in 3 of cases in Israel. But disease wasn't very severe. It was very mild. In the United States, among adults, 500,000 adults died, compared to 335 children. In Israel, among 300,000 children who were infected, 1,200 were hospitalized, 1 in 7 in moderate to severe condition, and 10 died. However, with the emergence of the Delta variant, which is 60% more transmissible than the original variant, Infection in children has become much more common, and children are getting sicker. So in Israel, children represent more than 50% of those diagnosed with COVID-19. In the United States, children are about 20% of those diagnosed. And hospitalizations have also risen. So children now, the rate of hospitalization for children has increased fivefold in the United States. For kids between the ages of 0 and 4, it's gone up 10 times. And yesterday at the meeting of the FDA, additional data came out regarding the risks of COVID in 5 to 11-year-olds. So the FDA.
I will put it on.
Hello? Someone have a question? So the FDA presented data yesterday showing that in 5 to 11-year-olds, there have been infections in 2 million children. 2 million kids have been infected in that age group with COVID-19. 8,300 have been hospitalized. 1 in 3 children who have been hospitalized with COVID-19 is in an intensive care unit. There have been 100 deaths. Death from COVID is the 8th leading cause of death in children 5 to 11 years old. 5,000 kids have developed something called multi-system organ failure, which is a potentially life-threatening complication of COVID in children. It leads to hospitalization. It leads to requiring life support, and also leads to myocarditis. And it's estimated that the incidence of COVID in children is even greater than that was reported, because blood samples show that probably 6 times as many children have been infected with COVID than have actually tested positive. So COVID-19 in children exists and can potentially be dangerous. So reasons to vaccinate children would include preventing infection, preventing the anxiety associated with infection and hospitalization, reducing the chances of severe disease, preventing long COVID, which is this phenomena of long-term symptoms that persist or arise several weeks after initial infection and can affect any organ system, the respiratory system, the neurologic system, the neurocognitive function. It leads to fatigue, loss of taste or smell, and these symptoms can persist for weeks or months. And it's very common in children. A study from England shows that about 1 in 7 children infected with COVID actually develops long COVID, which translates into more than 40,000 children in Israel. Italy has shown that 50% of children who are diagnosed with COVID have at least one symptom 120 days after their diagnosis. So a very real phenomenon. Vaccination will also reduce the chances, reduce lockdowns, which ultimately will benefit children because lockdowns interfere with learning and interfere and harm children's mental health. The vaccine will also prevent the development of variants. It will allow us to return to normal life, parents to go back to work. It will restore the world, which ultimately will benefit our children because our children will ultimately inherit the world. The side effects of the vaccine in children are similar to those in adults. So kids get headaches, fever, chills, muscle aches. However, critics of the vaccine have pointed out that we didn't really know all the side effects of the AstraZeneca vaccine until millions were vaccinated. We didn't know that it increases the risk of blood clots until real time. And so they worry that we don't have long-term follow-up on the COVID vaccine, and we don't know what the true long-term risks are. Also, they worry about myocarditis, inflammation of the lining of the heart. And the best information we have about the frequency of this phenomena, of this risk, is from Israel, from the Ministry of Health, which reported on 5 million Israelis who received both doses of the vaccine, and found that there were 136 confirmed cases of myocarditis in our population. 129 were mild and resolved on their own with very minimal intervention. Data from Clalit shows that the risk is 0.2 per 100,000 in women and 0.4 0.2 per 100,000 in women and 4 per 100,000 in men. And in children, people from the ages 16 to 29, because that's really the youngest age group we have good data on, the risks are a little bit higher, 5 per 100,000, 10 per 100,000 in men. So a rare side effect that is generally mild and much less severe than the potential heart complications that arise from COVID infection. Well, 28% of people who are hospitalized with COVID have some heart involvement. And so when one weighs the risks and benefits of the risks of myocarditis, the risks of infection far exceed the risks of the vaccine. However, perhaps the most compelling reason to vaccinate children against COVID-19 is the societal benefit. Vaccinating children will decrease transmission to the vaccinated, the unvaccinated, and to those around us. In addition, children may have a moral obligation to vaccinate based on the duty to rescue, which requires individuals to take steps to help others in danger, to save them from potential danger, especially if it can be done at minimal personal cost. And children already do this. Children routinely receive the flu vaccine to prevent their grandparents from becoming infected, even though the vaccine has a 2 in a million risk of a very rare disease or syndrome called the Guillain-Barré syndrome that's potentially life-threatening. Children undergo rubella vaccination to prevent infection in their mothers, in whom rubella can cause congenital abnormalities if they're pregnant. And they do this even though the vaccine has a slight risk, a very rare risk of a severe allergic reaction. And perhaps children should be making the same sacrifices, taking the same steps to protect the rest of the society from COVID-19. Now, those who argue against vaccinating children point out that children have made huge sacrifices during the pandemic, compromising their education, and compromising their mental health with lockdowns and social distancing. And really, this is just, there's too much to ask for children to do this. However, we will not reach, the only way we can reach herd immunity in a fast and sustainable way is to vaccinate children, which will help restore the world to normal and ultimately will benefit them. So what does Halacha have to say? Does Halacha obligate parents to vaccinate against COVID-19? And the answer is yes, based on the following. Parents have an obligation to promote the health and well-being of their children, which includes vaccination. I'm just trying to share my screen with you. Which includes vaccination, especially during a pandemic. So there are multiple potential sources for a parent's obligation to promote the health and well-being of a child. And I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to take a moment to share my screen because it's not working. Oh, here we go. One potential source of a parent's obligation to protect the health of their child is from Mishlei, which states, Al timna minar musar, do not withhold discipline from a child. And the Ralbag interprets this as an obligation of parents to prevent the premature death of their children. However, Mishlei is not often quoted as the source of a parent's obligation to promote the health of a child. Another potential source is Kiddushin 29a, which lists a father's obligation to his child, including the opinion that he should teach him how to swim. And the Gemara asks why, my Tama, and answers Chiyitzehu, that his life depends upon it. And Rashi explains that if the child was on a boat and the boat capsizes, he could drown. And that's why the father must teach him how to swim. But the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch do not codify this position into law, presumably because they follow the opinion of the Tanna Kama, who does not require a father to teach the child how to swim. Reb Yitzchak Weiss, Mincha Yitzchak, was asked about a father's obligation to his mentally retarded child who suffered from Yisurim Kashim, severe physical pain. The doctors had a treatment for him to relieve him of his suffering, but the treatment required money. And the father was poor. And so he asked, must I go out and beg to raise money for his treatment? And Rav Weiss answered, yes. Why? Because parent is obligated to protect the health of his child. Hinei pshita dechayav ha'av v'ripoi banav ubnotav haktanim zerufua bichlal mazonot v'chutz mizeh yesh gam mishum achsariyut v'lo tamar al dam reyacha lahashkiach basar hayeled v'lo ya'aseh ma shebichol lahoshia lo. That a parent is obligated to promote the health of a child based on the obligation to provide food. Food is synonymous with healthcare. Also based on the mitzvah lo tamar al dam reyacha, do not stand idly by. And the parent must do everything in his power to relieve his child of suffering and to prevent cruelty. But everyone's obligated in lo tamar al dam reyacha. How is a parent's obligation different? Is it different? And so Rav Yaakov Emden suggests that it is, that the closer the family relationship, the greater the obligation in lo tamar al dam reyacha. And a parent's obligation is the closest. Parents' relationship to a child is the closest that possibly exists. And so the parents have the greatest obligation in lo tamar al dam reyacha to their children. Tzitz Eliezer, Rav Eliezer Waldenberg, the rabbi of Sharon Tzedek Hospital before Rav Asher Weiss, was asked about a father's obligation to provide orthodontia. And he says, again, the father is obligated to provide healthcare based on his obligation to provide food to the child, because food is synonymous with healthcare, and the father has an obligation based on v'hashevota lo, the obligation to return a lost object. Reb Tzvi David Hoffman was asked by a doctor, is he required to force parents to accept a life-saving surgery for their child? And he writes, "V'lo matzino mikol haTorah kula sheyesh la'av v'em reshut l'sakein nefesh yaldehem u'limnoa harofei mileravotam." That nowhere have we seen in the Torah that a parent may endanger the life of their child and withhold treatment from the child. And so parents have an obligation to promote the health and well-being of their children based on lo tamar al dam reyacha, by hashevota lo, the obligation to provide food, because food is synonymous with healthcare, as well as the obligation to prevent the child from suffering. I think that it's, in my mind, it is striking that Tzitz Eliezer's tshuva deals with orthodontia. And nevertheless, even though we're talking about a preventive treatment, Rav Waldenberg obligates the parent to provide this treatment to the child. And I think that one message from this is that a parent's obligation to provide health care isn't just when there's active disease, to take the child to the hospital when he has a fever to 105, to take him to the moked to get stitches when he's bleeding profusely, to take him to the hospital when he has a broken limb, but also to provide preventive measures, preventive treatment, of which vaccination is an essential preventative measure. And so virtually all poskim obligate parents to vaccinate their children against routine childhood diseases. Rabbi Bleich has stated that vaccination of one's children is unquestionably a parental responsibility. When Rav Elyashiv was asked whether parents may be forced to vaccinate their children against whooping cough, he said that they may, because parents must give their children, follow normal practice. And if vaccination is normal practice that the world does, parents must offer this intervention, especially if legitimate governments endorse or especially if they mandate this treatment. But not all poskim agree that parents can be forced to administer vaccines. Rav Neuwirth, as quoted by the Nishmat Avraham, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, believe that parents may not be forced to vaccinate their children. Some have said perhaps Rav Rav Auerbach took this position because he was talking about a situation where disease burden was low, where there was not a lot of infection in the community, where we had reached herd immunity, and that he might rule differently in a situation where there was not herd immunity, where the disease was rampant. Which brings us to the issue of herd immunity and the argument some parents might make. We're going to reach herd immunity whether my child vaccinates or not. Why should I subject my child to the risk of vaccination to achieve herd immunity? We'll get there anyway. And so poskim have had various reactions to that argument. Rav Yaakov Ariel has suggested that this is a mistaken argument, that we can possibly reach herd, we cannot possibly reach herd immunity with COVID-19 unless we vaccinate. And even if we could reach herd immunity in the absence of vaccination, it would take so long and lead to tremendous unnecessary loss of human life. Rav Asher Weiss has strongly criticized parents who take this approach in the context of the measles vaccination. He compares parents who say, I don't need to contribute to herd immunity, I won't vaccinate my kid, we'll get there anyway. He compares parents who make that statement to Dor HaMabul or to Sodom, where people said, I'll steal one apple, one orange, not enough to constitute theft, but enough so that if enough people did this, the merchant would certainly never survive. He would lose his business. And if all parents take this approach, we will never reach herd immunity. He also cites the Gemara in Baba Batra that requires all citizens to contribute to the construction of a wall. And he says, why? Why does everyone have to contribute? Why does even an orphan have to contribute? The wall will get built whether everyone contributes or doesn't contribute. And the answer is that when it comes to issues of public safety, everyone must contribute, even the orphan, everyone must contribute to herd immunity. Other halachic principles that would require parents to vaccinate their children against COVID-19 include dina de malchuta dina, the principle that the law of the land is the law of the land, and where governments mandate vaccination, halacha would require parents to follow the law. And also the possibility of creating a Chilul Hashem. We've all watched in horror as religious communities refuse to vaccinate against measles, and leading to outbreaks in the community and consequently desecration of Hashem's name. What about the argument that I don't need to vaccinate, God will watch over my children, I don't need to vaccinate them, Hashem will protect them. Shomer P'tim Hashem, the halachic principle that allows people to take certain risks because God will protect them. Does this apply to vaccinating one's children against COVID-19? And the answer is that it does not. Shomer P'tim Hashem does not apply in situations where there is a known danger that can be easily averted. And certainly the dangers of COVID-19 can be avoided by vaccination. In addition, Rabbi Bleich points out that while an individual might have the prerogative under certain circumstances to invoke Shomer P'tim Hashem to justify dangerous behaviors, one does not have that prerogative for others. I can't decide if someone else should take a risk or should rely on Shomer P'tim Hashem, and certainly not parents who have an added responsibility to their children. So yes, halacha obligates parents to vaccinate against routine childhood diseases, and this obligation is heightened during a pandemic. So until very recently, parents had few options to protect their children in the midst of a pandemic. In fact, the only option they had was to evacuate. And so how does halacha view parents who refuse to evacuate their children in the midst of a pandemic? Magen Avram, as well as the Mishnah Berurah, refers to them as chayavim b'nafshotam, which Rabbi Emanuel Jacobowitz interprets as criminally negligent. Now, with the emergence of vaccines, the Tshuva Me'ahava, a disciple of the Noded Yehuda, notes that parents who refuse to vaccinate their children in the midst of a pandemic have dam banav barosho. They have the blood of their children on their heads. And Lakewood, a statement from the Lakewood community and the Agudat Israel in response to the measles pandemic, classifies children who do not vaccinate in the midst of this, in the midst of the epidemic, as rodfin, as pursuers. They're literally pursuing the immunocompromised and the unvaccinated to ultimately infect them. So yes, parents must vaccinate their children against COVID-19. Halacha would require them to vaccinate because they have an obligation to promote the health of their children in general, vaccination in particular, especially in the midst of a pandemic. So while this question of a parent's obligation in vaccinating their children against COVID-19 is, to me, quite fascinating, I'd like to focus the rest of our time learning together on an even more dramatic question, which we often don't discuss, and that is whether children have an obligation to undergo COVID-19 vaccination, and whether children have an obligation in the mitzvah of lo tamal dam reacha. Do they have an independent obligation? And so, as I mentioned earlier, children routinely have historically undergone vaccination against rubella, which is a very mild disease in children, but when their mothers become infected and they're pregnant, can lead to severe congenital abnormalities. And in the 1970s, the New York State Department of Public Health embarked on perhaps the most effective vaccination campaign in the history of public health. And their purpose was to vaccinate as many children against rubella as possible. And their technique was to recruit the children and get the children to want to vaccinate, get the children to actually turn to their parents and beg their parents to vaccinate. And so they posted posters like this for children in areas where children would see them: protect mommies from German measles. They showed in publications is a very sweet little boy, Andy, with his Rubella fighter membership card, which says, let it be known that on the 23rd day of November, 1970, Andy has received rubella immunization and is hereby certified as a member of the official Rubella Fighters Club of New York State. By being immunized, this official club member has protected other children and mothers against rubella, against the spread of rubella. But the most compelling method that they used to encourage children, to encourage vaccination, was the Rubella umbrella advertisement, which appeared on WPIX, a local TV channel in New York, during children's programming. And in the advertisement, a little girl is carrying this Rubella umbrella, which was white with red polka dots. Remember, rubella creates a red spotted rash, similar to the red dots on the umbrella. And the male voiceover asks, "Hey, little girl, what's that you're carrying?" And she answers, "That's my Rubella umbrella," and proceeds to explain to the audience what rubella is and why children should vaccinate. And then the Department of Public Health started a Rubella umbrella contest that children should send in pictures, and the best Rubella umbrella would win a prize. 23,000 kids sent in pictures. The campaign was so successful that beforehand, 15% of parents knew what rubella was. Afterwards, 65% knew, and 530,000 kids vaccinated. And why? How did this work? Well, kids saw the advertisements the same way they see advertisements for cereal and beg their parents for cereal. The same way they see toys advertised and they beg them to buy toys. Kids saw the advertisement and they drove their parents crazy. And so one mother sent the following complaint to the New York State Department of Public Health. She said, "Thanks to you, my kid is driving me crazy. I'm homesick and all he wants to do is go out to get his rubella vaccine." So, are children obligated in mitzvah lo tamal dam reacha? Does halacha obligate them to receive the COVID-19 vaccine? Well, according to biblical law, children do not have an obligation in mitzvah until they reach gil mitzvah, till boys reach the age of 13, until girls reach the age of 12. However, Chachamim instituted the mitzvah of chinuch, that children should have an obligation in mitzvot to promote their education in performing mitzvot. And so the Mishnah in Chagiga teaches us that children are obligated in the mitzvah of re'iyah, of seeing going to the Beit HaMikdash 3 times during the year, for the Shoshet Regalim, for boy, according to Beit Shammai, from when they're old enough to be carried, according to Beit Hillel, when they're old enough to hold their father's hand and walk to Yerushalayim. Mishnah and Sukkah teaches us katan she'inot tzarich l'imo chayav b'sukkah, that a katan who no longer needs his mother is obligated to sit in the sukkah. And then the Mishnah tells us the story of Shammai Hazaken, shepichet maziva v'sichech al gabei hamita b'shvil katan. Shammai Hazaken built a sukkah for his 1-day-old grandson. And finally, the Mishnah in Sukkah, katan hayodea l'na'anea chayav lulav. A katan who knows how to shake the lulav is obligated in the mitzvah of lulav. And so a child who undergoes vaccination, at the very least, fulfills the mitzvah of lo tamarol dam reyacha as part of his obligation in the mitzvah of chinuch. I'd like to take a few moments to learn a little bit more about the mitzvah of chinuch, to illustrate just how seriously, just how important this mitzvah is, and how serious a child's obligation is in the mitzvah of lo tamarol dam reyacha, purely based on chinuch. And so the first issue I'd like to address is the origin of the mitzvah of chinuch. Is it biblical or is it rabbinic? Well, there are 2 Gemarot that suggest that it's actually biblical in origin, that it's midrabanan. However, the Chai Adam suggests that it's midivrei sofrim, midivrei Kabbalah, which some have interpreted as biblical. And the Meshech Chachma actually states that it is biblical based on a pasuk from this week's parsha, Ki yedativ l'man asher yitzaveh banav ve'et beito acharav. That God Hashem singled out Abraham to instruct his children and progeny. What is this reference to instruction? It is a reference to chinuch. Rav Asher Weiss agrees that the mitzvah is biblical based on this pasuk. So for those that believe that the mitzvah of chinuch is biblical, the obligation and lo tamarol dam reyacha purely based on chinuch is even greater. Who does the mitzvah of chinuch fall upon? Does it fall upon the parent or does it fall upon the child? Well, why might this question be relevant? If the obligation falls upon the parent, then okay, the parent teaches the child lo tamarol dam reyacha, lechanech seminit, by taking him to get vaccinated. But if it falls upon the child, that would suggest that halacha might require children to take an active role in COVID-19 vaccination and literally badger their parents and make them go, take them to get vaccinated. And so to answer this question, poskim address a related issue, which is, can a child fulfill a mitzvah on behalf of an adult? Now, there are 2 Gemarot which and before we answer that, by way of introduction, there is a halachic principle that one can only fulfill an obligation on behalf of another if the person fulfilling the mitzvah has the same obligation as the people he is fulfilling it, the person he's fulfilling it for. And so Gemara in Masechet Brachot teaches that a child may fulfill the mitzvah of Birkat Hamazon on behalf of a parent. However, Gemara in Masechet Megillah explains that the child may not fulfill the mitzvah of Megillah on behalf of a parent. And so Rishonim take various approaches to resolve this apparent contradiction. The Ritva rules that the obligation of chinuch falls exclusively on the parent, and that is why the child cannot read the Megillah on behalf of a parent. And how does he explain the Gemara in Brachot, where the child can fulfill the mitzvah of Birkat Hamazon on behalf of a parent? He explains that in Brachot, we're dealing with an adult child. Tosfot rules that the mitzvah of chinuch falls upon the child. And that is why the child can recite Birkat Hamazon on behalf of the parent. And why can't he read the Megillah for the parent? Well, that has to do with a technical detail regarding the mitzvah of Megillah. And so poskim who believe that the obligation of chinuch falls upon the child often will cite Tosfot into support of that position. And for those who believe that the obligation falls upon the child, halacha might require children to take an active role in COVID vaccination and to literally do what they did with the Rubella vaccine and make sure the parents take them and make it happen. From what age does chinuch begin? So from the Mishnayot that we learned together, Katan is obligated in the mitzvah of sukkah when he is old enough to sit without his mother. He is obligated in the mitzvah of lulav when he's old enough to shake the lulav, when he knows how to shake the lulav. He's obligated in the mitzvah to go to the Yerushalayim for Shloshet Regalim when he's old enough to hold his father's hand and walk. And Tosfot suggests that there isn't one uniform age when chinuch begins, but it really depends on the child's level of knowledge. What is clear, though, is that the child merely needs to be able to perform the action. He does not need to understand the significance of what he's doing. A child is obligated in the mitzvah of sukkah when he can sit in the sukkah, not when he understands that the sukkah represents the ananei hakavod and what that represents. And so this generally occurs around the age of 5 or 6. However, what about children who are younger than 5 or 6? We have the story of Shammai Hazaken that built a sukkah for his 1-day-old grandchild. Why might a child be obligated from such a young age? And the Ritva explains that Shammai Hazaken believed or understood that ken hadin b'chol mitzvah l'chayvo b'chinuch kol zman she'afshar v'ra'oi lakach, that a child becomes obligated in the mitzvah of chinuch once he's capable of performing that mitzvah. And truthfully, a 1-day-old child who's brought into the sukkah could actually fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah because all he needs to do is show up. And by the same token, a 6-month-old, once the COVID vaccine is authorized for him, could technically fulfill the mitzvah of lo tamal damrayacha merely by letting his parents bring him there and vaccinate him. However, we don't rule like Shammai, and instead we know that the obligation of chinuch starts at a later age. Sorry. Do you have a question? Please, if you don't have a question, can you mute? And we'll take questions at the end. The Shla suggests that even though the obligation chinuch, the mitzvah of chinuch doesn't begin until later, parents should start instructing their children in the mitzvah of chinuch from when they're old enough to speak. And a parent who does so is praiseworthy. What's the purpose of immersing children in mitzvot when they're 1 day old from such a young age? So the Kabbalistic explanation is that by immersing him in mitzvot at such a young age, he will become used to it and he will live a life that is filled with mitzvot. So children from the age of 5 already can begin to perform the mitzvah of lo tamal damrayacha purely based on their obligation of chinuch, and even if they do it when it's younger, harei ze meshubach, all the better. The last issue, which suggests how seriously halacha approaches the mitzvah of chinuch, is how halacha views the status of mitzvot performed prior to reaching gil mitzvot. So our 11-year-old son will become bar mitzvah on Kaf Chet Iyar in a year and a half, please God. And if he starts counting the Omer properly on the second, every night, starting on the second night of the first night of Chol Moed, the second night, and he does it consistently every night, may he continue to count the Omer with a bracha after he reaches Gil Mitzvot for the end of the Omer. And so poskim disagree whether he can or can't, but the majority of Achronim rule that he can continue counting with a bracha, suggesting that mitzvot performed before reaching Gil Mitzvot have halachic validity. And so a child who undergoes vaccination, at the very least, fulfills the mitzvah of lo tamal damrayacha based on the obligation, based on the mitzvah of chinuch. a mitzvah which halacha takes very seriously, as illustrated by its potential biblical origin, the status of mitzvot performed before reaching gil mitzvot, and the mitzvah applies from the age of 5, although 5 or 6, although one who performs it earlier is most praiseworthy. And it may even fall upon the child, suggesting kids must take an active role in fulfilling this mitzvah. However, I'd like to suggest that children may have an obligation in lo tamad al dam reyecha, an obligation to vaccinate that transcends the mitzvah of chinuch, that's independent of chinuch, that's comparable to the obligation an adult has. And there are several mechanisms by which this children might have a separate independent obligation in mitzvot and lo tamad al dam reyecha specifically. So the first mechanism is based on Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach. The 7 Noachite laws. So when does a non-Jew become fully responsible as an adult in Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach? Well, not lo nitna lahem shiurim kol shesechlo shalem karaoi. Non-Jewish children become obligated in Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach not from a specific age, but when they develop mental, some level of understanding, some level of knowledge. And that typically occurs way before the age of gil mitzvot. So the question is, if non-Jewish children become fully obligated in the 7 Noachite laws at some point before reaching gil mitzvot, when do Jewish children become obligated in the 7 Noachite laws? Do they only become obligated when they reach gil mitzvot, or when they become b'nei dat, when they develop some level of understanding, as would non-Jewish children? The Binyan Av explains that, actually says, no, Jewish children become obligated in Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach when they reach gil mitzvot, because performing mitzvot requires understanding, it requires responsibility, it requires life experience, it requires decision-making capacity, and this can only occur when one reaches gil mitzvot. However, the Or Sameach points out, it's not possible that non-Jewish children have more mitzvot than Jewish children. It's not possible that non-Jewish children have a full obligation in Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach before Jewish children will. And so he rules that Jewish children become fully responsible in Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach from when they reach some level of understanding, an age earlier than gil mitzvot. And Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach agrees. So for those poskim who believe that Jewish children become fully obligated in Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach before reaching gil mitzvot, the question is, does lo tamad al dam reyecha, do not stand idly by, qualify as one of the 7 Noachite laws? The Minchat Chinuch rules that it does not. However, there are possible indications that lo tamad al dam reyecha could qualify as one of Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach. Perhaps it qualifies as part of lo tirtzach, do not murder. And the suggestion of that is the fact that the Rambam discusses the mitzvah lo tamad al dam reyecha in Hilchot Rotzeach u'Shmirat HaNefesh, in the laws of murder. Another option is that lo tamad al dam reyecha is part of the 7th Noachite law, the requirement to set up a legal system, which the Ramban defines broadly to include an obligation to set up a legal code. And part of that is setting up a moral code. And lo tamad al dam reyecha is an essential principle of a moral society. In fact, many countries, many communities have Good Samaritan laws, which requires people to take steps to save others in danger, especially if that can be done at minimal personal cost. Kids do this with their duty to rescue by vaccinating against the flu for their grandparents and rubella for their mothers. Another potential avenue by which children could have an independent obligation in mitzvot, and lo tamal dam re'echa specifically, is suggested by Rav Tavori. Rav Tavori writes that the mitzvah of chinuch may only apply to mitzvot ben adam lamakom, mitzvot between man and God. But a katan may have a full obligation in mitzvot ben adam lachavero, mitzvot between man and man, mitzvot between individuals. And the ultimate example of a mitzvah between individuals is lo tamar dam re'echa. And finally, I'd like to focus on the nature of reward a child receives for performing mitzvot, which suggests that a child's performance in mitzvot is something more, maybe something more than chinuch. So a child who performs a mitzvah receives the reward of an eina mitzvah v'yoseh, someone who performs a mitzvah but is not obligated to do so. Similar to a woman who performs a time-bound commandment, or a slave who performs a mitzvah. The Maram Sheik explains that he fulfills a mitzvah, but someone who performs a mitzvah, who is an eina mitzvah v'yoseh, who is not obligated, has done a mitzvah. It's not as strong as the mitzvah v'yoseh, the one who is commanded and nevertheless fulfills the mitzvah, but it's still considered a mitzvah. Now, Rav Moshe Feinstein writes that that there is room to say that a child who fulfills mitzvot actually is rewarded as a mitzvah v'yoseh, as someone who is obligated and fulfills the mitzvah. And if a child can be rewarded as a mitzvah v'yoseh, it suggests that something more than just chinuch is going on when a child performs a mitzvah. We actually know that under certain circumstances, someone who is a mitzvah v'yoseh, someone who is an eina mitzvah v'yoseh, someone who performs a mitzvah but is not obligated to do so, can transform that mitzvah into an obligation. And the classic example of this is women in the mitzvah of shofar. The Maharil and the Beni Ish Chai, the Rav Palim from Baghdad, point out that women are not obligated in the mitzvah of shofar because it is a time-bound mitzvah. However, they have taken this mitzvah upon themselves. Rav Palim writes, they have transformed this mitzvah into an obligation. So much so that they must make every effort to be in shul for Kriyat Megillah, and they must, and if they miss Kriyat Shofar, they must. Some poskim would say they need to do Hatarat Nadarim, and so I'd like to suggest that children may have transformed their obligation, transformed the mitzvah of chinuch, their performance of mitzvot from the mitzvah of chinuch, from an eina mitzvah v'yoseh into a full obligation without even realizing it, by undergoing vaccination against the flu and by undergoing vaccination against rubella to help and protect others. And so I would suggest that Halacha would rule in favor of COVID-19 vaccination of children. Halacha would obligate parents to vaccinate their children to fulfill their obligation to protect the health of their children, which includes vaccination, especially during a pandemic. And Halacha might require children to undergo vaccination and fulfill the mitzvah of lo tamal dam re'echa as part of the mitzvah of chinuch, a mitzvah which Halacha takes very seriously. As illustrated by the potential biblical nature of the mitzvah and the halachic status of mitzvot performed before reaching gil mitzvot. It applies to children from age 5, but if younger children are fulfilling the mitzvah, all the better. And it is possible that it falls upon children as well. It's children's responsibility. And children have a direct obligation to be actively involved. And I'd like to also suggest that children have an obligation in mitzvah lo tamal dam re'echa, an obligation to vaccinate that transcends the mitzvah of chinuch, an independent obligation. based on those poskim who suggest that children are obligated in Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, that children have a full obligation in mitzvot between man and man, and the nature of a reward a child receives for performing mitzvot before reaching Gil Mitzvot, and the possibility that children can transform mitzvot to a full obligation, much as women have done with Tkiyat Shofar, blowing shofar. And the possibility that children are obligated in Lo Tamod Al Dam Reyecha and obligated to undergo COVID-19 vaccination has far-reaching implications. Suggests that children potentially should take an active role in vaccination, that Halacha would strongly encourage them, if not obligate them, to really behave in a way that they did during the Rubella vaccination, badgering their parents to take them to go to get vaccinated. Halacha would encourage advertising that appeals to children, and Halacha would likely side with children who want to get vaccinated when their parents object. And so may the zchuyot of our tinokot shel Beit Rabban merit us the end of the pandemic, or at least help us reach herd immunity as quickly as possible. I thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to answer questions.
May I ask 2 questions?
Please.
Or do you want them in the chat? Okay, 2 questions. First of all, I just wanted to see what your take would be in regard to Kibud Avayim. If, let's say, the parents are objecting and the children say, well, my friends are doing it and the teachers tell us we should do it. So where Kibud Avayim comes in. And second of all, I don't know if you want to go back for a minute. At the beginning, you raised the question of, these third world type countries saying that they haven't even gotten 1% or small percent of their populations vaccinated, and we're already giving boosters and children. And are we at all obligated to share? I mean, I'm not going to give away my last container of milk either. So if you could address that, would be very interesting.
Wow, 2 outstanding questions. Thank you. So the first question about Kibud Avayim, Rav Aviner wrote a tshuva about this. The child wants to vaccinate, the parent doesn't want him to vaccinate. Where does Kibud Avayim fit into this decision? And his answer was that the child may vaccinate against the parent's wishes for the following reasons. Number 1, Shulchan Aruch states very clearly that Kibud Avayim only pertains to what has direct bearing on caring for the parent. It relates to feeding the parent, clothing the parent, bringing the parent in and out, addressing the parent's needs, and does not relate to things that upset the parent. And so whether or not the child vaccinates is beyond the realm of Kibud Avayim. Secondly, he says that if a parent asks the child to go to the store to bring him food, the child should do that, but he's not expected to spend his own money to bring the parent food. And by the same token, he wouldn't be expected to pay with his health to perform Kibud Avayim. And his final point is that based on the pasuk Ish Shimo V'aviv Tiro V'Shabtotai Tishmaro, which the Gemara explains, teaches us that if a parent asks the child to violate a prohibition, either biblical or rabbinic, the mitzvah overrides, or the isur, the prohibition overrides Kibud Avayim, because ultimately we must keep mitzvot, and our connection to Hashem overrides the parents' wishes. Regarding your second question, diverting vaccines to third world countries and whether we should be boosting third world, the bigger question that has burnt through the world, that has really generated a lot of debate, is whether we should even be boosting our population with a third dose when the third world countries that haven't even vaccinated 1% of the population. And the same question pertains to kids who have relatively mild disease. And that is a topic for Sharon itself. Please God, I have an article coming out in the next few days in the Lair House, which addresses this question. But Halacha would suggest that first and foremost, a government's obligation, especially a Jewish government's obligation, is to its people, and the rest of the world comes afterwards. But it's a complicated question, especially in the world that we live in, where we're really a global, we're globalized, and infection in Africa affects us, because if it's a high rate of infection, there are going to be variants, and variants will come to us, and variants are good for us. So balancing our needs with the needs of the rest of the world is very challenging. But I think that ultimately Halacha would favor community taking care of itself first and foremost. That's where the obligation lies.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions?
תודה רבה, שרון.
תודה לכם.
טוב לכולם.
ערב טוב. בשורות טובות.
אמן.